This will be the first of a series of lectures about clustering. I'm going to give a brief introduction to clustering, the motivation, the idea behind clustering, and then talk a bit about k-means as an example of clustering and the Lloyd's algorithm for computing k-means, which is not only meant to be a simple first algorithm for understanding clustering, but it also helps us give an informal look at expectation maximization, which is a generic approach that is very important that we're going to see again later in other clustering and in other types of unsupervised learning algorithms. So let's start with the idea of clustering, the motivation, and what clustering is. So what we want to do with clustering is to group examples together that are similar and separate those groups that are dissimilar. So this is the general idea. We are not trying to do some classification or regression, try to fit the model to some previously known target values, but we want to find this structure in our data by grouping together things that go together. So in this particular example, we can intuitively see three clusters here, three clouds of points that we are mentally grouping together by their Euclidean distance. We can see that there are groups of points that are closer to those within the group, and they seem to be somewhat separated from those in other groups. Now, the tricky part here in clustering is to objectively and rigorously define these measures so that then we can compute the clusters for our examples. So what we need is to find the smallest difference or the maximum, the largest similarity within clusters, and to maximize the difference or minimize similarity between different clusters, so that things that are closer together, more similar or less different, go inside the same clusters, and things that are more different go into different clustering. So clustering requires some measure of similarity or difference, either one can work, but that we can then use to try to organize the examples. The motivation for clustering is mostly to help us understand data and their relations, or to find relevant examples that represent the data and so on. So this is an important part of how we understand things. We group things by how alike they are, and we organize them mentally in this way. So this not only helps us deal with large amounts of data, but it also helps us identify meaningful groups, make sense of the structure in the data, and so on. So remember that the purpose of clustering is to help us understand the data. So all the measures that we are using and the approach, the definitions that we want to conceive for our clusters, all this approach must bear in mind the goal of helping us understand the data. This is an example, an early example of clustering, Darwin's tree of life. We can see this sketch for the relations between different species, where Darwin wrote, I think. So this is what he was thinking about, where the similar species descend from recent common ancestors, but then less similar species descend from older common ancestors, and so on. And this is a way of organizing the species, the living organisms, so that we can capture this structure, these relations between them. Another example of clustering in this paper, it was used density-based clustering, using data from mobile phones from users in China to identify regions in cities where there was a very low density of people at night. So basically there were empty blocks of apartments where nobody actually lived, and so they managed to identify ghost cities or ghost blocks in cities where there were lots of apartments but no people living in them. So this was another application of clustering, and there are many different applications. These are just examples where clustering can help us make sense of the data. So we can use clustering to find the structure in the data, to understand the data better, but also to summarize the data. We can use prototypes or representative examples to stand in for all the examples that are similar to those, and this can help us, for example, improve performance in other tasks by selecting only representatives of our data. For example, here we could have this initial cloud of points, the blue points there, but we could find a set of representatives that is smaller than the original number of points, but still represents the distribution of points and the density of points at different regions, only with a smaller number of examples. So this would be an example of reducing the data by summarizing it while retaining the same structure. And we can, with clustering, control how much we compress the data or summarize the data. We will see another example in this lecture further on of vector quantization, which is used for this kind of compression, of summarizing of the data that we have. Now, one problem is defining clusters, because even the objective sometimes of clustering is a bit subjective, because we want it to help us understand the data. So there must be a subject that is trying to understand the data, and the definition of how the clusters will be created, or the metrics and so on, all those criteria will have to fit with the purpose of clustering. So we can ask if we have, for example, two clusters in this set of points. This could be one way of clustering these points. Or we could consider we have three sets of clusters, because there are these 4 points here that seem to be far away from the others. Or even 5 sets of clusters, 5 sets of clusters, and so on. So it's at some point we will have to make some decisions about how we're going to define the clusters. And as we will see in the next lectures, there are different algorithms for defining clusters, and we need to choose the appropriate ones for our purpose. One question that we need to answer is, if we want to do clustering all at the same level, partitional clustering means that we are dividing the data into a partition, into groups at the same level, or if we want to do hierarchical clustering, where we have large groups and then smaller subgroups and smaller subgroups, like a tree where we are nesting groups inside larger groups. So this would be an example of partitional clustering, where we divide these points into 5 clusters, all at the same level, so to speak. So we are partitioning the data into 5 non-overlapping clusters. Or we could do hierarchical clustering. So in this case, we can start by splitting the points into the red cluster and the green cluster. And then the green cluster we divide into 2 subclusters, which are the triangles pointing down and the triangles pointing up, which is a different group here. And the red cluster we divide into 3 subclusters, which are the 3 shapes we have here: the squares, the hexagons, and the circles. So this would be an example of hierarchical clustering, because these smaller clusters are subsets of the larger clusters at a higher level in the hierarchy. Another thing that we need to decide when clustering is how to define the membership of each example. We can have exclusive clustering, where each example only belongs to one cluster, or we can have some forms of overlapping clustering, where examples may belong to more than one cluster. And this can be either the examples belonging to 2 clusters or 3 clusters or something like that, or using numbers, continuous variable, to specify how much one example belongs to each cluster. So we can do that with fuzzy clustering, where we associate with the pair of each example and each cluster a number ranging between 0 and 1, which gives us a fuzzy membership value, so that examples can belong more or less to each cluster. Or we can use probabilistic clustering by adding the additional constraint that the sum of the memberships of any example to all the clusters is 1, so that we can interpret this measure of belonging to a cluster as the probability of being in that cluster. So, and we're going to see that later on, some examples of these. We can also decide whether all the examples are going to be part of clusters, so this would be complete clustering, or if we want to do partial clustering and leave some examples unassigned. For instance, we can consider that some examples are noise or irrelevant and leave them outside of all the clusters. Then the data itself may impose some constraints on how we can find meaningful clusters. In some cases, we have well-separated clusters in which the members of each cluster are more similar to all other members of a cluster than to members of a different cluster. So this would be an example of well-separated clusters where, for example, the blue points are all closer to each other than any of these points is to a red point or a green point. But it may happen that we have other types of clusters which are not well separated. And then the way we define the clusters will also interact with the shape of the data and the distribution of the examples to determine how the points will be clustered. For example, if we use prototype-based clustering, where we have some prototypes marked here as crosses that define which cluster each point belongs to by assigning a point to the cluster with the nearest prototype, then we will have, for example, like this, the separation between clusters being these lines that are halfway between the line joining the two prototypes. So if we assign each point either to this cluster or this cluster based on the distance to the prototype, then we are separating the two clusters in a straight line here. All the points here to the right will belong to the blue cluster, and all the points to the left to this brown cluster here. So depending on how the data is shaped and how we define the clusters, we will have different results. And so we must think about the kind of algorithms that we use to cluster our data in order to make the results meaningful for our purpose and for the data that we have. For example, if we have something like this, it may make sense to use prototype-based clustering, because this way we assign the points to the closer prototypes and it works more or less. But if we have a distribution of points like this, then it wouldn't make sense to define the clusters by the prototypes, because if we had a prototype here, for example, these points will belong to the same cluster as the blue points and things would get a bit confusing. So in this case, we can do something different, for example, using contiguity-based clustering, where we are grouping points together based on the neighbors they have and the sets of common neighbors that we can find. So between this point here and this point here, we can find a path through close neighbors all the way on this curve of points that does not include any point from this green set here. So using different ways of defining clusters, for example, contiguity-based or density-based, in this particular case, we are separating these three clusters, green, blue, and red, because they have dense clouds of points. These black points here we consider noise. They are in low density regions, and we consider them not to belong to any cluster. So we can, in this case, using density-based clustering with noise, we can adapt our results to data where we want to discard low density regions and just identify those contiguous regions of high density. So basically, when we are applying clustering, we do not have this objective well set up from the beginning like we had in supervised learning, where basically we want to approximate our predictions to some known target values. We want to make data more intelligible or find some meaningful structure in the data, test some hypotheses or something like that. And so we have to decide how to cluster the data in accordance to those objectives. And we need to think about how we compare examples, what measures do we use to determine if examples are near each other or similar to each other or more different, how we decide on the membership of examples to clusters, if they all belong to clusters, if they can belong to several clusters, and so on. How do we group them together? What defines a cluster? Is it distance to some representative? Is it some sort of contiguity, density, affinity, things like that? So different algorithms will give us different results here. And then there is also a very difficult part, which is validating the clusters. There are some measures that we can use, but in many cases we need to think if the clustering that we are getting makes sense, bearing in mind the purpose for which we are doing the clustering. So remember that we are using clustering not just for itself. It's not just something that we can easily automate by measuring some error to some target value. We need to think about what clustering is for, and having that in mind, determine if the result we have is meaningful. So comparing clustering with classification, we can see this immediate difference that in classification we have those target labels for the classes, but those are present in the data. And what we want to do with our model is to predict those class labels, and we can supervise the training of the model by comparing the predictions to the targets that we have in the data. In clustering, we do not have those labels in the data from the start. So with clustering, we will also do something that is analogous to classification, because we will assign each example to some category, to a cluster, but these clusters are created by the model and are not given to us in the data. So we can think of clustering as analogous to classification, but having the model invent the classes or create the classes in which the points will be placed. Okay, so let's see k-means clustering as a simple first example. And the idea here is to find the best clustering of points, so the best way to group the points together, assuming there are k clusters. This k parameter is determined by the user. The number of clusters is defined a priori by the user. And now the clusters are defined by proximity to a point that is the mean point of the cluster. This k, the number of clusters we have, is predefined, and this is a partitional clustering, means that all the groups are formed at the same level. It's exclusive. Each point belongs to only one cluster. It's complete because there are no examples that are unassigned. All examples are assigned to a cluster, and it's prototype based because these centroids, these points at the mean of each cluster, are the representatives, the prototypes, comparing with which we will determine in which cluster each example belongs to. So let's see the Lloyd's algorithm for computing k-mean, so for finding the best solution for this problem of assigning the points to the clusters and computing the representative, the position of these centroids. And so we can start with a random set of centroids. If we want k clusters, we start with k centroids at random. And then we are going to repeat these steps. We are going to assign each example in our data to the closest centroid. And then after we have the assignment, we are going to move the centroids to the mean point of each respective cluster. And then we are going to repeat this until we have no more changes, until everything converges and doesn't change anymore. So let's start with this set of points. This is our starting data. And the first step that we need to do is to start with a random set of centroids. So if we want k clusters, we need to pick a starting point with a set of k examples, k coordinates here in this space, so that they are the first positions of the centroids. With for the initialization, we start with a random set of examples. So we take from all our data set, we take with reposition a sample of k examples, and these will determine the initial position of our centroids. An alternative initialization method is to use random partition. In random partition, each of the example is randomly assigned to one of the k clusters that we have. So in this case, we have 5 clusters. So each example is randomly assigned to one of the 5 clusters. And then we compute the centroids by taking the mean point, the average of all these examples. So this triangle here is the centroid of the triangle group. That is the average of the coordinates of all the points assigned to the triangle cluster. And the same for the circle, and so on. In either case, whether we use random partition or Forgy, we start with some random distribution for the centroids and all the points assigned to some particular centroid. So that now we can continue these iterations by moving the centroids, recomputing the assignment, and so on. So let's see an example here. We start with this the original data, and now we're going to iterate through Lloyd's algorithm. We will begin with a random set of points selected as the initial positions for the centroids, for the clusters. So once we choose those points at random, we now assign each example to a cluster based on the distance to the centroids, to the prototypes that represent the cluster. So these circles here are closer to the circle centroid. These triangles are closer to the triangle centroid, the square, and so on. And now we are going to recompute the position of the centroids by moving each centroid to the mean point of the cluster that is assigned to that particular centroid. So as you can see, for example, the triangles here are spread out to this side. So the triangle centroid will move to this position because this is the average of the coordinates of all the triangles. And the same thing for the circle, the blue hexagon there, the triangle, the green triangle there, and so on. So once we do this, we now recompute the clusters. And since the centroids moved, the points are now assigned to different clusters. For example, these triangles here that were assigned initially to the triangle cluster now are assigned to the circle cluster. So since there were changes in the membership of the points, the mean point for each cluster is now different, so we need to update again the position of the centroids. And after updating the position of the centroids, we recompute the assignment of the clusters, and we keep doing this iteratively until we have no more changes. So eventually there will be no change in membership of the clusters, and if there is no change in membership of the examples in the clusters, then the centroid position will remain the same and everything stops. There is no more difference between one iteration and the next, and the algorithm stops. So if you want to implement this, it would be easy. What we need first is to have a way of picking the closest points to the centroid. So for all the points, we can find which centroids are closest to the point, and we can do this by looping through our data and computing here a vector with the distances to all the centroids. Basically, we compute, in this case, the Euclidean distance, which is the square of the difference in the coordinates, and then we add, so we get the square of the distance. Using the square of the distance, we can now find the index in this vector that has the smallest value, and so this is the index of the centroid that is closer to this particular point. And now we can assign each example to the closest centroid. Then we can move the centroid position to the mean point of each cluster. We are going to compute, to assign all the examples to the centroids, and then for each centroid we will select all the examples that belong to that particular cluster, that particular centroid, and we average the coordinates of those examples. So basically we are selecting the examples that belong to each cluster, averaging those coordinates, and moving the centroid for that cluster to that mean point of the data of the examples in the cluster. To initialize this, we can either use the Forgy method, which consists on sampling without reposition from our data. We are going to shuffle the indexes that point to all the rows in our data, and then we're going to pick the first k after shuffling. So this will give us a set of k different examples chosen at random from our data. If we do random partition, then we will start by creating a vector of random numbers with reposition. So there can be repetitions here, but these are all ranged from 0 to k, which is the number of clusters that we have. And this will be the assignment of examples to clusters. They are assigned at random to the k different clusters. And now we're going to compute the position of the centroids by computing again the mean point of all the examples that belong to each particular cluster. So this would initialize our centroids using this random assignment of points to clusters. The big difference between these two initialization methods is that with Forgy initialization, we get an initial set of centroids that is more or less distributed like our data is distributed, because we are picking at random examples from our data. Whereas with random partition, we tend to get our centroids grouped in the middle of the cloud of points we have in our data, because we are averaging a random subset of the data for each centroid. But other than that, there are two ways that we can use to randomly initialize the clusters, and then we proceed with Lloyd's algorithm to get the result until convergence. Typically, we use Euclidean distance, but you can use any distance measure for finding the assignments of the points to the clusters. Euclidean distance is basically just one instance of Minkowski distance, where we use p equals to 2. So Euclidean distance is the square root of the square of the modules of the differences between the coordinates and the sum of those squares. If we use p with a different value, for example, p equals 1 is Manhattan distance. That is just the sum of the modulus of the difference between the coordinates, but you can use different values here, and they are all valid distances. This is conceptually similar to a self-organizing map, but without that topology with the neurons that are linked together in that two-dimensional matrix as we saw before. So in k-means, the different centroids can freely move independently of each other. One variant of k-means is k-medoids, which is useful when we can compute distances between our examples, but we cannot compute a mean point for our example. For instance, suppose that you are trying to cluster sentences or words or strings of protein sequences, something like that. We can find measures of similarity or dissimilarity between strings, but it's very hard to define what is an average of two strings or n strings. So basically, whenever we cannot compute a centroid, a mean point of the points in the cluster, we can use a medoid, which is one example in the cluster that is closer to all the examples. So basically in k-medoids, we only need this dissimilarity matrix. So basically a measure of distance, so to speak, in general terms, between different examples. It's actually more general than a distance. It doesn't have to meet the criteria of distance mathematically. But what we do is to assign each example to a cluster by comparing to the medoids. The medoids are representatives of the cluster. And then when we want to choose a better medoid, we look for all the examples in a cluster and see if there is one example there that is closer on average to all the other examples. And this will become the representative there. So it's similar to what we do with k-means, but instead of computing the mean, we are always selecting examples based on the distances, and we do not need to compute average examples. Okay, so this Lloyd's algorithm gives us a first informal look at a very important algorithm in unsupervised learning in several applications, which is expectation maximization. So let's consider something similar to what we did with supervised learning. We have this set of data, but in supervised learning we could observe the features X, and we could observe the class labels Y. Now here we are going to call the labels Z because these are latent variables. They are not observed by us, so we don't know what membership is at the start between each point and each cluster. So this is the Z set of variables that we don't know. We also don't know the parameters of our model. For example, the positions of the centroids, what we are trying to determine here. But we want to maximize the likelihood, like we did before. So remember, the likelihood of the parameters given a set of data is the probability of having that distribution of data if we assume the parameters to be correct. So what we want to do is to find the set of parameters that maximizes this probability. Now, with supervised learning, we use this approach by taking the features and the class labels, which were both observed in the data, and so we could define by maximum likelihood under some assumptions, we would find a function that we would optimize in order to find the parameters. Now, in clustering, these classes are not observed. They are not really classes like in supervised learning, in classification, but they are latent variables in the model. We do not observe them, and they can change from one iteration to the next. Because our model itself, we are trying to find the classes here or invent the classes by assigning points to different clusters. So how can we do this? This would be hypothetically what would be the correct clustering here. So the X, which is the set of coordinates of the points, and the Z, which is the assignment to the different clusters, blue, green, and red. But what we have is only the X, is only the coordinates, and we don't see the assignment anywhere. We'll have to find it somewhere in our model. So in order to compute this probability, the probability of having those points with those sets of coordinates assigned to those particular clusters, we cannot do this directly because we don't know what the clusters are, what are the labels for the different points. But what we can do is, if we have a prior estimate or a null estimate of the parameters, we can see, using that in conjunction with the features that we can observe, for example, the coordinates of our examples, we can try to estimate the probability of points belonging to different clusters. So basically we can try to find the expected values of Z, or the expected membership of all the points, if we have a previous guess of what the parameters would be. And this is the idea behind the expectation maximization algorithm. The expectation step is to create a likelihood function, so this type of thing here, by obtaining a provisional assignment of points to clusters using the expected assignment, the most probable assignment, for example, given the values of x, the features that we can observe, and an old estimate of the parameters, the previous estimate of the parameters. Now, using this assignment of points to clusters, we can now write a likelihood function that we will try to maximize. So this will be the likelihood function that is based on a previous estimate of the parameters, but can give us the probability of the data, assuming this assignment of points to clusters, for each set of values in our parameters, so that now we can maximize this function with respect to the new set of parameters in order to improve the parameters in our model by maximizing the likelihood. Now, the thing is that once we do this, we will now obtain different estimates for the assignment of points to clusters. So we have to repeat this until convergence. Basically, we start with some initial guess for the parameters. We use that to estimate where the points are assigned. This will allow us to write a function for the likelihood of our parameters, because now we have an assignment of points to clusters, and now we compute a new set of parameters by maximizing that likelihood function, and we repeat this until convergence, or until we do some number of iterations and don't want to do anymore. So we can see k-means as a sort of a simplified instance of expectation maximization. It's not quite expectation maximization because we don't have these probabilities, but we can see the idea here. Let's suppose that we have this distortion measure. This is how we measure how good or bad our clusters are, which uses the distance between each point and the representative of the cluster, so that centroid, the square of the distance between each point and the centroid, for all the points that belong to that particular cluster. So this Rnk is a function that will give us 0 if point n does not belong to cluster k, or 1 if point n is assigned to cluster k. So basically, we are only counting here the points that are assigned to the cluster k, and we want to minimize the sum of these quadratic distances of all the points to the representative. And we can imagine that we are doing this alternating. First, we can minimize this objective function with respect to the membership of each point to a cluster. So this variable, this latent variable z, in this case, would be represented here by the assignment of points to clusters. And what we can do is, if we assign each point to the closest centroid, we can minimize this sum here, because we will be always using the smallest possible distance when adding all these distances. So first we can minimize this with respect to the membership by assigning each point to the closest centroid. And now we can minimize this with respect to the position of the centroids by minimizing this quadratic function here, and this is obtained by putting the centroid coordinates at the average point of all the examples that belong to that cluster. So basically we can see this expectation maximization algorithm here, the idea, which is first to compute the most probable assignment, which basically is the one that gives us the smallest value here, and then using that assignment we maximize the likelihood by changing the position of the centroids. Of course, this is strictly speaking not expectation maximization, because we are not dealing with probabilities and maximizing the likelihood, but we can see here a very simplified example of this idea of jumping back and forth between the assignment to the clusters and the computation of the parameters, in this case the centroids, for the different clusters, which is the basic idea behind expectation maximization. Now, in future lectures, we're going to look at expectation maximization in a more formal detail, but this one gives us this basic first idea. Uh, later we're going to see this with Gaussian mixture models, which are probabilistic clustering methods, a probabilistic clustering algorithm. And so in this case, we will see exactly an implementation of expectation maximization, because then we will explicitly deal with those probabilities. So now let's see an example of using k-means. One application in which k-means is often used, which is the original idea behind k-means, is for vector quantization. Vector quantization is an approach to compressing signals, and basically we are quantizing some continuous range of values so that we reduce this continuous range to a set of representative values. We're going to do this to quantize the color values of an image. This example is taken from Wikipedia and based on a demo on color quantization on scikit-learn. And the image, the advantage of this image is that it doesn't have red in it. So the red channel of the image is all 0, and we only have a green, we only have red and green, and the blue channel is 0. So we only have two channels, red and green here, and we can easily represent all the values, the color values of the pixels into dimensions. So this is the image, and we can now take each pixel and represent it in a coordinate coordinate system, where we have red here in the horizontal between 0 and 1, and green here between 0 and 1. Since there is no blue, we are representing all the colors of all the pixels in the image. You can see there are some greens, some blacks, some yellows, and so on, and these are all represented here. So if we want to find a smaller set of colors that are representative of this range of pixel values, we can try to do clustering here and find the representatives of this distribution. And we can do that with k-means. So we're going to use k-means from scikit-learn. Scikit-image is useful for reading the image file. Basically, what we do here with imread is to read the PNG file, decompress it, because PNG is a compressed format, and this will return a NumPy array with all the values between 0 and 255 for all the colors in all the pixels. So what we have is an array that has as many rows as the width of the image, as many columns as the height of the image, and as many layers as the colors that we have, the color channels. So for a red, green, blue image, this will be 3 layers for the color channels. But here we can ignore the blue channel because we know there is no blue on this image, and so we can just consider the first 2 layers. So we can put this as a matrix with all the pixels by reshaping this so that we have everything converted to values between 0 and 1 by dividing by 255. And then we have a matrix that has as many rows as the number of pixels in the image, the width times the height, and as many columns as the number of channels that we have, red, green, and blue. And now we just throw away the last column, the blue, and retain only the first 2. So this will be the set of coordinates for all the pixels in the data, which are these coordinates that I'm plotting here. These are all the pixels in the image that we have. And this is an example of how you can plot this, this chart by plotting all of these points in the coordinates given in this matrix. So the x coordinate is the first column, which corresponds to red, and the y coordinate is the second column, which corresponds to green. And then we can just use the original colors as a list to assign different colors to the different pixels. So we can have this effect where we have them represented at the position corresponding to the color and also with the color that they have. Okay, so this is just how to process the data, load the image and obtain these channels. And now we can use k-means to create to find the positions of these representatives of these prototypes. As you can see here, in the regions where we have greater density of points, we have closer centroids to one another. Where the points are more spread out, we have more distant centroids. So the centroid position is reflecting the distribution of the colors that we have in the image. So we can use 64 centroids. We create the k-means object with this number of clusters, and then we fit it to the image array. This computes the positions of the centroids, and now we can predict to which centroid each point in our image belongs to. So we use the predict of the k-means after fitting, and this gives us an array with the labels. So each label is an integer that indicates to which of the centroids the point is assigned. And now we can also draw those crosses for the centroids. Basically, I'm doing two scatters here because I'm writing across an X marker in black and then overlaying it with a white marker so that we get this effect of having a white cross over a black cross that is slightly larger, so that we can see it both on the lighter colors and on the darker colors. But this is just a trick to do that plot, but it gives us an idea of how the centroids are distributed. And now, if we want to do color quantization, we can now convert all the pixels to the color that is defined by the centroid. So basically, we're going to convert all of these different colors into just 64 colors. And we can do that easily by, for each pixel in our data, we are going to set its values, the red and green channel there, to the same coordinates as the centroid to which this pixel belongs. So the labels IX gives us the index of the centroid for this particular pixel, and we take from the centroids the coordinates of that pixel. And now we can save the image again by reshaping it. So we are changing the original coordinates here, the original colors, just the red and green channels. This matrix still retains the blue channel, but it's 0 everywhere. So we can now reshape this matrix and save it as a PNG image. And we can compare the two images. This is the original one, which used 8 bits for each color channel. And now we are going to compress that using only 64 colors. So 64 colors can be represented in just 6 bits. So you go from 24 to 6 bits, and you can see that there is practically no difference between the two images. It's very difficult to see that this one only has 64 colors. And we can go further there. We can use, for example, only 8 centroids. This is 3 bits. And we can now, again, convert all the pixel colors to the color of the corresponding centroid, which gives us just these 8 colors. And now we can write the image only in 8 colors. In this case, this is a lot more compression. You can see that we lost color resolution here, but it still keeps more or less the same image. So this is an example of an application of k-means for quantization, vector quantization applied to colors. You're going to do a similar example in the tutorial class. And in this case, we don't actually save size on the image because then the PNG format doesn't take advantage of this. There are other formats that can use color tables like GIF and things like that, but PNG doesn't take doesn't take advantage of that. But this is just an example of how you can use k-means to find a smaller subset of representatives of some continuous values that you have, so that you can compress the data in a meaningful way. The interesting part here is that the distribution of the centroids follows the distribution of the data. It's sparser here where the points are farther apart, and more concentrated in the regions where we have a larger concentration of points. So to sum up, we saw the idea of clustering, grouping data by similarity, but note that we don't have, in all cases, a very well-defined objective for this. So we need to think about what similarity means and what criteria for clustering do we need, and then decide on all of these. If we want hierarchical or partitional clustering, if we want to assign all examples to cluster, if that assignment is exclusive, or if there are points can share different clusters, types of clusters that we're going to define, if they are based on prototypes, contiguity, density, and so on. And then we started looking at k-means, which is a partitional clustering based on prototypes, and we saw that both for vector quantization and as a simplified example of this expectation maximization algorithm. We're going to go back to this algorithm later on with more formally and a more rigorous look at this algorithm. But for now, it's this general idea that we are first creating the likelihood function by estimating the values of the latent variables, which are the membership of the points to the different clusters. And then we maximize that likelihood function to adjust our parameters. And we repeat this by using the new set of parameters to give us another estimate of the membership and so forth. So you can read more about this on Bishop's book. There is an introduction to expectation maximization there too. And also you can see in Marsland's book a comparison between k-means and self-organizing maps, so the relation between the two.